June 14, 1982. Johannesburg. At 10:45 p.m., a resident walking his dog near the Kensington industrial edge called police after finding a woman lying beside a gravel access road. Officers from the Johannesburg City Police arrived first. Their headlights cut across the vacant lot. The radio crackled with short bursts of traffic control chatter. The scene was secured within minutes. A perimeter cordon was marked with yellow rope. Detectives noted tire marks near the curb and a handbag several meters from the body. A faint chemical odor drifted from the nearby workshop area. The victim was identified as Elaine van Rensburg, age 27. She worked as a bank clerk in the city center and was last seen leaving her shift shortly after 9:30 p.m. She had boarded a local bus toward Kensington but never reached her stop. Paramedics confirmed death at the scene. The body showed bruising to the neck and a torn sleeve on the right arm. No identification was missing from the handbag. Her wristwatch had stopped at 10:02 p.m. At 11:20 p.m., detectives from the Serious Crimes Unit took control of the case. They collected trace samples using standard issue paper envelopes. Each item was logged manually on Form 17A. A cigarette butt was found near the fence line, half pressed into the soil. One button from the victim's blouse was recovered nearby. The forensic photographer documented 24 images on black and white film. The shutter clicked softly in the still air. By 2 a.m., the body was transported to the state mortuary. The area was re-examined under portable floodlights before officers cleared the site. The pathologist's report later confirmed asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. Estimated time of death around 10 p.m. There were no defensive wounds, suggesting a prolonged struggle. Toxicology showed no alcohol or sedatives. Investigators believed the attack was sudden, possibly by someone she knew. However, no immediate suspects surfaced. The crime scene evidence was sealed, labeled, and placed in the Central Evidence Store at Johannesburg Police Headquarters. Chain of custody documentation bore the signature of Detective Inspector M. Koza. Dated June 15, 1982, the cigarette butt was logged as Exhibit 14B. At that time, it was tested only for brand comparison and nicotine type. DNA analysis did not exist in local practice. Detectives interviewed Elaine's colleagues, neighbors, and relatives. She was described as punctual and private, with no known conflicts. She had recently transferred departments at the bank, but maintained routine hours. Her last phone call, placed from a pay booth outside the station, was to confirm transport home. A week after the murder, police circulated composite sketches of two unidentified men seen near the bus route. No witness could confirm interaction with the victim. The investigation broadened to include nearby factories and security guards working night shifts. By August 1982, over 60 interviews had been conducted. None produced a lead. The case drew limited media coverage. Newspaper reports described it as a troubling assault on a young professional. Public attention shifted quickly as other violent crimes occupied headlines. By early 1983, the case was officially listed as unsolved. The complete file, photographs, witness statements, and forensic notes, was transferred to long-term storage. Items were sealed in brown paper packets, stamped Kensington 1982. A clerk entered the record into the central register by hand. The ink on the logbook has since faded. Inside the envelope, the cigarette butt remained. Fibers adhered to it under residual adhesive. Unknown to anyone then, it carried preserved biological material that decades later would identify a suspect. Elaine's parents released a short statement requesting privacy. Her brother assisted police with background details, but left South Africa within a year. Friends organized a small memorial at the local church. Attendance was modest. The case already felt forgotten. The police revisited the file briefly in 1985 after two similar cases occurred nearby. Comparison of fingerprints and shoe impressions found no match. Both new cases were later solved, unrelated to Elaine's death. The Kensington case returned to the shelf. In 1982, South Africa's forensic infrastructure was limited. Blood group testing, fingerprint analysis, and fiber microscopy were primary tools. DNA profiling was still 3 years from its first use in the United Kingdom. Records were handwritten. Evidence storage relied on climate-controlled cabinets, but not all were properly sealed. Within the police archives, hundreds of unsolved cases accumulated. The file marked K820614 was one of them. By the late 1980s, the original detectives had retired or transferred. Their notes remained thin and fading. The city had changed. New crime priorities filled the board. For the Van Rensburg family, the absence of resolution endured quietly. Birthdays passed without ceremony. The photograph of Elaine at her office desk remained framed in her parents' living room. Decades later, when a cold case unit reopened archived evidence boxes, one technician noticed the sealed envelope labeled Exhibit 14B. Inside lay the cigarette butt collected that night. It would become the key to uncovering what happened on that June evening. The file that once gathered dust was about to reveal a name. Morning traffic moved slowly across the eastern side of Johannesburg. Inside the Serious Crimes Unit, the case file labeled K820614 remained on the duty desk. Detectives met briefly to review statements from the first night. A stenographer typed up notes from the initial patrol reports. The sound of the typewriter echoed across the narrow office. Detective Inspector M. Koza assigned 2 officers to trace Elaine van Rensburg's movements in the 24 hours before her death. The plan was to rebuild her final routine, every bus route, every colleague, and every contact. The process began with a single map spread across the desk, pins marking her known locations. Elaine lived alone in a small apartment near Yeovil. She commuted by bus 5 days a week to the Standard Trust Bank in the central business district. On June 14th, she had taken her usual route in the morning, clocking in at 8:04 a.m. Her supervisor confirmed she worked a full shift and stayed late to balance end-of-month accounts. She left at 9:25 p.m., carrying a leather handbag and a thin folder of paperwork. Surveillance cameras were not common then, and no footage existed from the terminal or the street. Officers traced the bus schedule. The driver recalled a woman matching her description boarding near Commissioner Street and exiting at Kensington Main Road around 9:50 p.m. That was her usual stop. No one remembered seeing her after that point. Detectives checked public telephones along the route. Maintenance records showed one call from the booth outside the station at 9:34 p.m., confirmed through a billing trace to her parents' home. The duration was 40 seconds. That was the last confirmed contact. The following day, police distributed information sheets to local businesses. They checked taxis, night shift factories, and gas stations. A few employees reported hearing a scream late that night, but the statements varied and lacked precision. Ambient factory noise and traffic made it impossible to confirm direction. Forensic technicians processed the clothing for fiber transfer. Under laboratory light, a pale blue synthetic thread was recovered from the collar. It was consistent with industrial overalls used in local manufacturing plants. That clue briefly expanded the investigation. By mid-July, detectives had questioned over 50 workers from nearby garages and warehouses. Most had alibis verified by time clock records. One man had left work early that evening. Elaine's parents visited the station twice that year. They asked if any new information existed. Each time, the answer was the same. No suspect, no witness. The detectives' notes from those meetings described their calm manner and quiet insistence that the case not be forgotten. The handwriting on those pages remains neat and deliberate. Within the department, resources were limited. Johannesburg faced rising crime rates. New cases filled every shift. Detectives often carried a dozen investigations at once. By September 1982, attention shifted to other priorities. The physical evidence from Kensington was sealed and moved to an auxiliary locker facility on Loveday Street. A brief memo recorded the transfer. It would remain there for nearly 4 decades. In the years that followed, Johannesburg changed rapidly. The 1980s brought new policing structures, political unrest, and administrative turnover. Records were shifted between divisions. Many original officers retired. Some case materials were destroyed to create space. The Kensington file survived by coincidence. Its box had been stacked behind heavier evidence and was overlooked during clearance. Meanwhile, the Van Rensburg family continued quiet contact with police. Every few years, they sent a letter requesting updates. Replies were formal acknowledgements, citing no progress. By 1987, technological advances abroad began shaping forensic practice. Articles about DNA fingerprinting appeared in professional bulletins. The South African Police Service took note, but lacked the infrastructure to apply it. Laboratories focused on fingerprint and fiber comparisons. The concept of genetic identification remained theoretical within local units. Inside the old evidence store, temperature fluctuated. Paper labels yellowed. The smell of dust and chemical preservative filled the room. Dozens of cases remained unsolved. Among them sat the sealed packet marked Exhibit 14B, Cigarette End. In 1990, when the Forensic Division relocated to a new complex, archivists catalogued thousands of legacy files. Each was assigned a barcode for computer entry. The Kensington file received number 4729 JHB 1982. Its digital record contained only 3 lines: victim name, date, and status, unsolved. A junior clerk inspecting the container noted that the packaging was intact. She resealed it with updated labeling and placed it in long-term storage. That administrative action ensured the sample's survival through decades of institutional change. The case remained dormant until the late 1990s, when the country established formal cold case initiatives. These units aimed to review unsolved homicides with potential biological evidence. Funding was limited, and priority went to more recent files. The Kensington case did not meet review criteria at that stage. Around that time, Elaine's mother died. Her father submitted a final written request for updates. The note was polite, signed with an unsteady hand. It was placed inside the file, but never answered. By 2005, DNA profiling had become standard practice in national forensic labs. Analysts routinely revisited older evidence to identify viable samples. Storage rooms were inspected, and remaining exhibits from the early 1980s were listed for potential testing. In 2007, the evidence technician who opened the Kensington box noticed the old cigarette butt still sealed in its original wax envelope. The handwriting was fading but legible. She added a recommendation slip suggesting future DNA evaluation. Funding delays postponed that process. The envelope was returned to the shelf. That same year, an internal audit noted that several older cases lacked digital metadata. The technician responsible for the Kensington file scanned the original photographs into the database. For the first time, the victim's image appeared alongside the case number in the electronic archive. Nothing further occurred for another decade. By 2018, a new forensic management system was introduced nationwide. It emphasized preservation of trace evidence from historic investigations. Each provincial unit was instructed to identify long-term exhibits that could yield DNA through modern extraction techniques. In Johannesburg, analysts reviewed a list of 300 unsolved cases. The Kensington file appeared among them. On the recommendation of the unit head, a team of forensic biologists selected several cigarette butts and blood-stained fabrics for pilot testing. The goal was to evaluate DNA survivability under local storage conditions. When they opened the Kensington package in October 2018, the envelope still carried the original seal. The paper was brittle but intact. Inside lay a single filtered cigarette, crushed slightly but preserved from contamination. Under a magnifying lens, traces of epithelial cells were visible along the mouth end. Samples were taken using sterile swabs. Chain of custody forms were completed electronically. The laboratory log recorded the new submission as DNA case 18JHB retro. It took several weeks to obtain results. The analysis produced a full male profile. At the time, South Africa maintained a partial national DNA database, primarily for convicted offenders. The new profile was uploaded and compared against existing entries. No immediate match appeared. However, analysts also forwarded the sequence to an international reference database maintained for cooperative investigations. That process required approval from senior officials, which delayed progress into early 2019. The case remained officially inactive, but the result signaled that preserved biological material could indeed yield viable DNA decades later. When the Cold Case Division reviewed findings in 2020, the Kensington sample was flagged again. A newer comparison method had been introduced, probabilistic genotyping, capable of identifying close relatives through shared alleles. Analysts decided to test the sequence against partial family reference data. The process matched the unknown DNA to a family line registered in Gauteng province. Further investigation traced the lineage to a man once employed at a factory less than a kilometer from the crime scene in 1982. His personnel file listed his name, Thomas Ndlovu, age 63 at the time of re-identification. The discovery reopened a case that had been silent for 38 years. Detectives located Ndlovu's current address in Rudaport. He had retired from industrial work and lived quietly with his family. Background checks revealed a minor criminal record for assault in the late 1970s, but no subsequent convictions. In February 2020, investigators collected a reference DNA sample using a buccal swab under court order. Results returned within 2 weeks, a full match to the cigarette butt from 1982. The chain of custody, intact since the original collection, provided admissible continuity after nearly 4 decades. Police finally had a name connected to the Kensington homicide. The arrest came quietly. 2 officers approached Ndlovu at his residence and informed him of the warrant. He appeared calm, denying involvement. During questioning, he claimed no memory of the victim and insisted he had quit smoking years before the crime. The statement was recorded, transcribed, and added to the file. Investigators reviewed employment logs, confirming that he had worked a late shift the night of June 14, 1982, at a nearby mechanical plant. Time clock records showed he clocked out at 9:45 p.m. The factory stood 8 minutes' walk from the location where Elaine van Rensburg was found. Further searches revealed that the company's uniform fabric matched the blue, synthetic fiber recovered from the victim's collar. The laboratory compared archived samples. Composition was identical, each small piece of evidence aligned after decades of separation. By March 2020, the case file expanded to include modern documentation, new DNA charts, typed transcripts, and updated photographs. The faded handwriting from 1982 now sat beside printed barcodes and digital signatures. The continuity between old and new evidence formed a clear investigative bridge. Reporters learned of the development through official statements, but coverage remained cautious. Articles focused on the forensic breakthrough rather than personal history. The tone reflected respect for the family's privacy. When the Van Rensburg relatives were notified, they expressed quiet gratitude. The detective's notes described the meeting as brief and subdued. No cameras were present. The case was now active again. Preparing for prosecution, detectives reopened the full file in early 2020. A new case number was assigned. Cross-referenced with the original 1982 entry, officers retrieved every physical exhibit, each envelope, photograph, and witness statement still bearing its original case stamp. The smell of aged paper filled the evidence. Investigators requested employment records from the factory archives. Stored on microfilm, they revealed that Ndlovu had been employed as a machine operator from 1981 until early 1983. Personnel logs showed multiple disciplinary warnings for absenteeism and 1 complaint regarding inappropriate behavior toward a female colleague. No criminal charges had been filed at the time. The DNA result placed him directly at the crime scene. Investigators needed to understand how the cigarette butt came to rest near the victim's body. In the 1982 report, it was listed as found within 1 meter of the deceased, pressed into soft soil. The forensic reconstruction indicated that the smoker would have been standing close enough to observe or interact with the victim shortly before the attack. When questioned, Ndlovu denied smoking in that area. He stated that he often walked through Kensington after work, but had never seen the victim. He said he smoked a local brand similar to the one found at the scene, but claimed it was common at the time. His statement was calm, measured, and without visible anxiety. Detectives noted the absence of reaction when shown photographs from the original file. To strengthen the case, investigators sought additional corroboration. They reviewed archived police duty logs for June 14, 1982, looking for any patrol reports that might mention unusual activity. One entry recorded a report of shouting heard near the industrial fence at approximately 10:05 p.m. The responding officer had checked the area but found nothing. His signature matched a name still active in the force until 2001. He was located in retirement and agreed to provide a statement. His recollection was limited after so many years. He remembered the night as cold and quiet. The report he filed had been routine, one of several minor calls. Yet he recalled seeing a man in a blue work overall walking toward the main road around that time. The description matched the old uniform from Ndlovu's factory. Though the memory could not serve as formal identification, it provided circumstantial consistency. Analysts also compared the 1982 fabric fragment to surviving samples from the factory's uniform supplier. The weave pattern and fiber composition were an identical match. Forensic chemists confirmed that the polyester cotton blend used in that plant was not commonly available in retail clothing during that period. The connection between fiber, location, and DNA formed the evidentiary triangle that prosecutors required. As detectives pieced together the historical context, they turned to the social patterns of 1982 Johannesburg. The Kensington area had been a mixed residential and industrial zone, with limited nighttime surveillance and poor lighting. Workers often walked home along the same paths used by commuters. Crime records from that year listed several unsolved assaults in nearby districts, mostly targeting women walking alone after dark. Investigators reviewed those cases for overlap. Only one involved a similar method: manual strangulation with no theft. That case had occurred 3 months earlier, less than 2 kilometers away. The victim survived, providing a description of her attacker as a middle-aged man of medium build, wearing work overalls. Police at the time had dismissed any connection, citing insufficient evidence. The surviving victim, now in her 60s, was contacted for a new interview. She agreed to meet under formal conditions. Her recollection was fragmented, but clear on key details. The man had approached her near a factory gate, spoken briefly, and then attacked without warning. She had escaped after striking him with a bag and running toward a passing vehicle. She could not identify Ndlovu with certainty after 38 years, but she confirmed that the uniform and location description were consistent. Investigators logged her statement as corroborative context. The forensic evidence remained the central element. Prosecutors reviewed every link in the chain, ensuring that the transition from 1982 procedures to modern standards met evidentiary rules. The cigarette butt had been preserved without chemical interference, ensuring uncontaminated DNA. The photographic documentation from both eras established visual continuity. In late 2020, a full investigative summary was compiled. The report spanned 412 pages, combining historical documents and modern analysis. It included a digital reconstruction of the crime scene using original photographs overlaid on current satellite imagery. The alignment confirmed that the body's location matched a shadowed recess near the industrial fence, an area invisible from the main road. That finding supported the theory that the attacker was familiar with the terrain, someone who knew the quiet zones behind the factories. Investigators next sought to establish motive. Elaine van Rensburg's life was examined again through records, letters, and surviving co-workers. Interviews with former bank employees revealed no personal conflicts or relationships outside work. One colleague recalled that Elaine had complained of being followed home several times, but never reported it formally. The information was new to the file, though unverifiable after so many years. Detectives speculated that Ndlovu may have crossed paths with her during regular commutes. His factory shift ended near the same time her bus arrived. The area's narrow roads forced pedestrians to share paths. A chance encounter could have escalated without planning. Forensic psychologists assisting the case reviewed behavioral elements typical of spontaneous violence during that period. The pattern aligned with opportunistic attacks linked to situational stress rather than serial intent. The conclusion described the event as a probable single offender, impulsive crime, not premeditated. The investigation timeline was reconstructed minute by minute. Based on the bus arrival and the stopped wristwatch, Elaine likely exited the vehicle at 9:50 p.m. The attack occurred between 9:55 and 10:05. The suspect's time clock record at the factory placed him outside by 9:45, walking distance from the gate to the lot was 8 minutes. That overlap positioned him at the scene within the correct window. A timeline chart presented to prosecutors aligned all data: clock out time, bus arrival, death estimate, and recovered DNA into a consistent sequence. As the case gained momentum, detectives faced the challenge of ensuring procedural compliance for prosecution. Defense counsel could argue degradation of evidence or incomplete storage records. To counter this, the forensic team produced environmental reports showing that the evidence cabinet's conditions had remained within acceptable ranges. Humidity, temperature, and storage material had been recorded during past audits, confirming preservation integrity. The laboratory's DNA documentation underwent third-party review to confirm authenticity. 2 independent analysts replicated the results using fresh aliquots of the same sample. Both matched the original sequence. Meanwhile, investigators re-interviewed former factory co-workers. One remembered that Ndlovu often stayed behind after shifts, smoking near the back gate. Another recalled seeing him with a small cut on his wrist around the week of the murder. These statements were entered into the file, but classified as secondary evidence due to limited verification. The team also sought to verify Ndlovu's movements after 1982. His employment history showed multiple job changes, all within the Johannesburg region. He married in 1986, raised 2 children, and had no recorded offenses for decades. Psychological assessment suggested a low likelihood of reoffending, but that analysis remained confidential. Despite the long passage of time, the forensic match left little doubt about his presence at the scene. In late 2021, prosecutors prepared an indictment for murder under revised cold case provisions, allowing charges on historical evidence. Ndlovu's defense filed motions to dismiss based on elapsed time and memory degradation. The court denied the motions, citing the integrity of physical proof and the preserved chain of custody. The investigative team continued gathering supporting materials, transport records, payroll sheets, and local crime maps from the early 1980s. They created a comprehensive visual presentation for the trial. Photographs of the evidence cabinet and the original film negatives were included to emphasize preservation accuracy. At every stage, the narrative remained procedural. Officers avoided speculation. The focus was on establishing connection through verifiable facts. The senior detective leading the reopened case described the experience as methodical rather than emotional. The notes from those meetings recorded phrases such as "no anomalies found" and "chain verified through document overlap." Each small piece of the past was accounted for. In November 2021, Ndlovu underwent a second interview after legal counsel reviewed the evidence summary. He maintained innocence, but offered no alternative explanation for his DNA being found at the scene. When presented with the employment and location timeline, he stated that he could not remember details from that period. His statements remained consistent but uninformative. Investigators compared linguistic patterns in his testimony with archived interviews from the 1970s, where he had been questioned in unrelated matters. The phrasing and tone were similar, controlled, factual, and detached. The behavioral analysis noted that his answers reflected habitual caution rather than deception. Though the forensic data outweighed any verbal assessment, the investigative file closed with a comprehensive timeline. Stretching from 1982 to 2021, it illustrated how one small, preserved item had linked 2 generations of policing. The press coverage remained restrained. Journalists summarized the developments without speculation. The focus was on forensic progress, particularly the demonstration that biological evidence could survive decades in basic storage conditions. Public reaction was subdued but respectful. Within police circles, the case became a reference example in training materials about evidence preservation. New recruits were shown how a single misfiled object could later determine justice. The Kensington file was digitized in full and used in seminars on chain of custody continuity. The investigation phase officially concluded once all material had been certified for court submission. The detective's final note read simply, "Case prepared for prosecution."
Chain intact.
All exhibits verified. The air in the records room was still when the file was closed again, this time not to be forgotten but to await trial. The last photograph taken of the evidence envelope showed the original 1982 signature beside the new barcode label. A visual bridge between past and present, forensic science had filled. The silence left by memory, the first official. Notice to the Van Rensburg family, arrived by registered mail in March 2020. The letter came from the Johannesburg Cold Case Division, confirming that new forensic analysis had identified a suspect. The document was brief and procedural, yet the significance was immense. For nearly 4 decades, silence had been the only correspondence they received. The sound of the envelope being opened in their living room marked the first new development in 38 years. Elaine's father, now in his 80s, sat at the same table where she once did her bookkeeping. He read the letter twice. The ink was faint blue, the tone formal. It informed him that DNA evidence had linked a former factory worker to the 1982 investigation. There was no description of the suspect, no expression of sympathy, only notification. He folded the paper carefully and placed it inside the frame that held her last photograph. For the surviving family, the news triggered conflicting emotions. Relief was tempered by exhaustion. Her brother, now living abroad, received the update through an email from the police liaison. He had left South Africa long ago, unable to revisit the memories attached to his sister's death. The email was clinical, yet the information carried unexpected weight. He described feeling detached at first, then unsettled. After decades of stillness, the case had suddenly returned. Friends who remembered the original event learned of the development through local media reports. A short article appeared in The Star, quoting the police spokesperson. It confirmed the arrest of a 63-year-old man in connection with a 1982 homicide. There were no photographs, no interviews, no speculation. The community recognized the case name immediately. Calls were made between former neighbors who had lived along Kensington Main Road in the early 80s. Some expressed surprise that evidence had survived so long. Others admitted they had assumed the case was permanently unsolved. In the weeks that followed, the local church where Elaine's memorial had once been held arranged a quiet service of remembrance. Attendance was small, fewer than 20 people. Most were older residents who had known her parents. The candles flickered in the draught from the doorway. No speeches were made. A brief reading acknowledged the reopening of the investigation and the persistence of forensic progress. The air in the hall carried a faint echo of the piano from the adjoining room. For those who had been part of the community in 1982, the revival of the case reopened old uncertainties. Many had felt the fear that followed her murder. Women who had lived nearby recalled walking in groups afterward, avoiding the dark roads behind the factories. The return of the story to public attention brought back memories of that time. Several residents contacted journalists to share recollections of police patrols, sirens, and the sense of unease that had spread through the suburb. Each account added small fragments to the social record. The new investigators requested permission from the family to review personal items retained since the early 80s. Elaine's father kept a box of her belongings, notebooks, letters, and photographs. The forensic team inspected the contents, hoping to find traces of contact or secondary evidence, though none remained useful. Still, the act of reopening the box held emotional weight. Dust settled softly across the table as the detective turned each page with gloved hands. The items were returned untouched, but the visit left a lasting impression on the family. Journalists approached the family repeatedly for comment. They declined interviews, preferring privacy. Their statement, issued through the police, thanked the investigators for their persistence and requested no further contact. The message reflected restraint and dignity. Reporters respected the request, keeping coverage factual. The focus remained on the broader implications of DNA technology in solving historic crimes. Within law enforcement circles, discussions turned to the human aspect of such delayed resolutions. Detectives noted how the emotional timelines of families differed from the procedural ones of investigators. For the police, closure came with evidence. For relatives, it came with understanding. In the Kensington case, decades had eroded both memory and context, leaving a void that no conviction could entirely fill. Retired officers who had worked the original case were contacted for comment. One described the night in 1982 when he stood over the crime scene, uncertain where to begin. He expressed quiet satisfaction that technology had completed what their generation could not. Another officer, long retired to the coast, wrote a letter to the new investigation team, thanking them for preserving the chain of evidence. His note mentioned the old evidence cabinet and how many believed it would one day yield answers. The community response remained subdued. Kensington had changed over the decades. The open field where the body was found had since been developed into a row of warehouses. Few residents knew the area's past. Still, the local newspaper ran a small feature describing how the cold case breakthrough highlighted the importance of record-keeping. The article mentioned the original detective by name and noted that his signature had been visible on the evidence envelope that solved the case. Among older residents, conversations resurfaced about how the case had shaped neighborhood caution in the 1980s. Parents recalled forbidding their daughters from walking home alone. The collective unease of that era had faded, but the reopening of the investigation reminded many of how vulnerable the city had felt at the time. Johannesburg's police precincts during those years operated with limited manpower and technology, relying on handwritten notes and radio dispatches. The public had rarely seen successful resolution in such crimes. At a broader level, the media's focus on DNA technology prompted renewed discussion about other cold cases. Advocacy groups for unsolved homicides cited the Kensington case as proof that evidence, even when decades old, could still produce results. Police officials used it as a case study during press briefings, encouraging citizens to report forgotten information from the past. The effect was measurable. Several other families came forward asking for re-examination of their own unsolved cases. For the Van Rensburg family, public attention brought mixed feelings. They appreciated the awareness, but disliked renewed focus on their personal loss. They had built quiet lives around the absence of closure. Now that absence had been disturbed. The detective assigned civil groups discussed the ethical aspects of delayed justice. Commentators debated whether trials after 4 decades could truly serve families, or whether they reopened old trauma without meaningful healing. The Van Rensburgs declined participation in those discussions. Their only public statement remained the one filed through police channels, gratitude for closure, tempered by respect for process. The trial's approach stirred quiet anticipation in the community. Few people expected it to reveal new information, but many wanted confirmation that the evidence had reached a legal conclusion. Local radio programs discussed the broader context of forensic backlogs and the role of cold case units in modern policing. The tone was analytical rather than sensational. Callers expressed sympathy for the family, but avoided speculation. Inside the police headquarters, the reopened file was often used to illustrate how community impact persisted beyond immediate investigation. Detectives undergoing refresher training reviewed the timeline as an example of why maintaining family contact over decades mattered. Notes from those sessions emphasized empathy and procedural transparency. The Kensington case had transformed from a single tragedy into a structural lesson. For Elaine's brother, the news prompted a visit to Johannesburg for the first time in many years. He attended a short meeting with investigators, viewed the evidence photographs, and then visited the site where the crime occurred. The warehouses now stood silent behind locked gates. He remained there briefly, looking at the location where the field once lay. A faint wind pressed against the metal fencing. He left without ceremony, returning to the airport that same evening. The family's interactions with the judicial process were formal. They attended preliminary hearings through remote video links, listening as prosecutors outlined the forensic chain and the steps leading to identification. The father remained composed, occasionally adjusting his glasses, but never speaking. After each session, the detective liaison called to summarize proceedings. By the time of the main hearing, public attention had diminished. Only one journalist attended the early sessions, seated quietly at the back. The absence of media pressure allowed proceedings to move steadily. For the family, each appearance in court marked both progress and renewed fatigue. Every fact presented by prosecutors was one they already knew, but had to hear again. Community response during this phase reflected respect rather than curiosity. The case had become part of local history, not dramatic, not forgotten, but closed in tone. Conversations about it were brief and factual, often focusing on the persistence of science rather than the crime itself. Residents who once feared the streets of Kensington in the 1980s now saw the event as a distant story from another Johannesburg. At the church where the early memorial had been held, one final gathering took place after the first day of the hearing. A small group of elderly neighbors attended. They sat quietly for several minutes, the light through stained glass dim against the walls. A simple remark ended the gathering, that even delayed justice remained justice. The sound of chairs moving across the floor echoed softly before silence returned. For those who worked the modern investigation, the family's composure became a point of reflection. The absence of anger or relief suggested a form of acceptance shaped by time. Decades of waiting had turned the hope for justice into a need for completion. Detectives noted how age had replaced urgency with endurance. In police records, the family's interactions were summarized in a few concise lines, dates, times, and brief comments. Yet behind those entries lay years of quiet persistence. The impact of the case extended beyond the crime itself. It influenced how institutions treated unresolved grief. The cold case division began including family communication reviews as part of procedural audits, ensuring that correspondence remained active even when investigations stalled. As the hearing progressed, journalists reported on its societal implications rather than courtroom drama. Articles focused on the significance of archival DNA preservation and how cases from the apartheid era could still find resolution. Public interest groups used the moment to advocate for modernization of forensic storage nationwide. Through all of it, the Van Rensburg family stayed out of view. They attended proceedings through official channels only, never appearing before cameras. Theirs was a presence of quiet endurance, the final echo of a story that had begun under streetlights nearly 40 years earlier. The broader community carried its own reflections. The case had come to symbolize both the passage of time and the durability of evidence. The field, where Elaine's body had been found, no longer existed, yet the truth preserved within a single item had survived untouched. The idea resonated that in some way facts could outlast decay. For the investigators, the impact was professional as much as personal. They saw in the family's restraint a reminder of why such cases mattered beyond conviction. Justice, even when delayed, restored record and memory alike. The silence that had once surrounded the Kensington file now carried a different weight, not absence, but acknowledgement. The community moved on quietly, as it had before. Streets changed, buildings replaced open ground, and new residents occupied old homes. Yet among those who remembered, the case remained a measure of endurance, a story less about the act itself and more about the persistence that finally revealed its author. After the initial investigation closed in 1983, the Kensington case receded quietly into archival space. It occupied a single line in the homicide ledger, one among hundreds listed as unresolved. The evidence boxes sat undisturbed behind metal shelves at Johannesburg Central Station. Each bore a date and reference number, handwritten and slowly fading. The room remained cool through winter, dust collecting along the fluorescent tubes overhead. Over the following decade, the city's police divisions changed repeatedly. Units merged, precincts relocated, and entire record rooms were reclassified. Each administrative reshuffle threatened older files. Paperwork from the 1970s and 1980s filled storage facilities that were never built to preserve history. Clerks, working under pressure to clear space, often discarded unclaimed exhibits. The fact that the Kensington evidence survived owed nothing to deliberate design. It remained because no one looked for it. In 1989, a minor flood at the Central Archive damaged a row of case files. Boxes near the floor absorbed water and were destroyed. The Kensington box had been stored higher, protected by coincidence. A photograph from that year shows technicians inspecting stacks of warped cardboard, the air thick with the smell of mildew and cleaning chemicals. On the top shelf, the box labeled K820614 appears dry and intact. Through the 1990s, as forensic science advanced abroad, South Africa's resources remained limited. DNA profiling existed in academic theory, but lacked funding for practical use. Laboratory capacity focused on urgent criminal cases, not old files. Technicians trained in new methods left for better-equipped departments overseas. The few who remained worked with microscopes, fibers, and fingerprint dust. The idea of reopening a 1982 murder seemed impractical. The Van Rensburg family wrote one letter every few years. Each was polite, identical in tone, and always unanswered. They never called. They simply waited for written acknowledgement. Eventually, even those letters stopped. The postal addresses changed, and correspondence was lost in transitions between offices. By 1995, the file no longer had a responsible officer. The cover sheet listed a series of reassigned names, each crossed out and replaced by another. The administrative record showed activity only in the margins, notes of transfers, sign-offs, and signature initials that meant little to anyone new. The city around it changed faster than the file itself. Kensington's open lots filled with new construction. The street where Elaine's body was found became an access road for freight vehicles. Layers of asphalt covered the soil, where investigators once worked by flashlight. No marker remained. Inside the police archives, silence persisted. The hum of the ventilation system was constant. The only movement, the slow oscillation of fluorescent light across the corridor. The evidence cabinet where the cigarette butt was stored held hundreds of envelopes like it. Most would never be reopened. The 2000s brought partial reform. A computerized case registry was introduced. intended to consolidate legacy investigations. Data entry clerks typed thousands of handwritten records into new systems. For many cases, only basic details were entered: victim name, year, and unresolved status. The Kensington case became 3 lines of text on a screen. When digital cataloging began, technicians handled each envelope individually. Some evidence packages disintegrated under touch, paper brittle with age. Others remained intact. The cigarette butt from 1982 still sat sealed in wax paper, the handwriting faded but legible. The notation read, "Cigarette end. Soil vicinity 1 mit north of body." The technician added a barcode label and replaced it in the drawer. That small action preserved its trace within the new database. The next 2 decades passed with minimal among the generation of officers entering service after 2000. Few knew the older cases by name. Training emphasized efficiency and digital documentation, not archival recovery. The existence of a file like K820614 was an abstraction. It represented an era when evidence meant physical weight. Envelopes, boxes, handwritten logs. In 2007, when the Central Archive relocated, staff sorted through thousands of boxes. Many were reclassified as inactive. The Kensington file moved again, this time to a facility outside the city. The building was newer, climate-controlled, and equipped with security cameras. The relocation process generated a new inventory, and the cigarette butt envelope received an updated chain of custody tag. The notation, "No degradation visible," was added. The handwriting from 1982 remained visible beside the modern printed label. The silence around the case persisted not because of neglect, but because of scale. Each archive contained hundreds of similar stories, incomplete, unresolved, quietly preserved. For every case reopened, dozens stayed untouched. By the 2010s, public attention shifted toward forensic advancements. Documentaries and press reports highlighted successes abroad, where cold cases had been solved using genetic methods. Within South Africa, similar efforts began, though resources remained scarce. The Forensic Division initiated small pilot programs to evaluate the viability of old biological samples. Only a handful of cases met the strict preservation criteria required for testing. The Kensington file was not among them. The officers who had handled the original investigation were mostly gone. Retirement, illness, and death had removed direct memory of the night in 1982. Only the documents remained to speak. Reading the file gave no sense of emotion, only process. Yet within those pages, typed in measured language, the silence carried weight. It reflected a time when investigation relied on intuition more than science, when evidence often outlived memory. In 2015, an internal audit traced the chain of old unsolved cases, still registered under pre-digital numbering. The Kensington file appeared again, its last recorded entry dated 1983. The auditor, a young officer new to the department, annotated it as potential historical review. Nothing immediate followed, but the notation placed it in the queue for eventual assessment under the cold case policy introduced 3 years later. When the policy took effect, its language was simple. Any homicide with biological material preserved under proper seal could be reassessed using modern DNA testing. That clause would later open the path to the Kensington case, though none of the staff at the time knew it. Throughout these decades, the Van Rensburg family carried their silence quietly. The father continued to live in the same home. The photograph of his daughter remained on the mantelpiece, dusted weekly but rarely discussed. The neighbors aged, moved away, or passed on. The house stood largely unchanged, its furniture familiar, its atmosphere static. The faint ticking of a clock filled most afternoons. Every few years, newspapers ran anniversary columns recalling Johannesburg's unsolved crimes. Occasionally, Elaine's name appeared among them, a single sentence between others. Readers glanced over the list, recognizing few. For most, the names were fragments of an earlier city, detached from the present. Inside the evidence storage facility, the air remained dry and cold. Fluorescent light flickered as technicians walked the aisles. The labels on the older boxes bore marks of age, ink fading to brown, edges curling slightly. Among them, the sealed envelope of the cigarette butt endured, unchanged. It held the microscopic record of a moment no one remembered. The silence surrounding the case lasted almost 4 decades. It was not broken by discovery, but by persistence. The routine of record-keeping, the unremarkable act of cataloguing a forgotten envelope. The file survived every transition by inertia alone. When the cold case unit finally reopened it in 2018, the sound of the seal breaking echoed faintly in the sterile laboratory room. That sound ended 36 years of uninterrupted quiet. What followed would turn that silence into evidence. The reopening of the Kensington file in 2018 began with a list. The cold case unit's forensic coordinator compiled names of unsolved homicides with preserved biological evidence. The list contained nearly 300 entries from across Johannesburg. Each case was assessed for storage integrity, documentation, and potential for DNA extraction. Most failed one or more criteria. Only 27 met the basic standards for testing. The file labeled K820614 was one of them. A junior analyst retrieved the sealed box from the evidence vault. Inside were several paper envelopes marked with the year and reference code. Among them, the one labeled Exhibit 14B, Cigarette End, stood out for its clarity. The wax seal remained unbroken. The analyst noted the intact condition in her log. The sound of gloves brushing paper was the only noise in the lab. The sample was transferred under chain of custody protocol to the National Forensic Laboratory. Each step was recorded electronically: withdrawal time, transport courier, and reception signature. In the sterile environment of the lab, the envelope was opened for the first time in 36 years. The air released a faint scent of old paper and sealing compound. Technicians examined the contents under magnification. The cigarette filter was slightly crushed but structurally sound. Using modern extraction methods, they collected microscopic traces of epithelial cells from the filter surface. These were placed into labeled tubes and processed through a DNA sequencer. The machine's quiet hum filled the room. Hours later, data began to populate the screen, peaks and curves forming the profile of an unknown male. The result was complete enough for comparison. Analysts verified the sequence, then cross-referenced it against the national database of convicted offenders. No match appeared. The file was flagged for potential familial searching once authorization could be obtained. In March 2019, approval came from the National Forensic Board to expand the search to include partial familial connections. The process compared genetic markers to those stored from relatives of known offenders. Within weeks, the algorithm returned a list of potential family connections with varying probabilities. Among them was a surname recorded in Gauteng province, and Ndlovu investigators traced the match to a man whose brother had served a sentence for unrelated assault in the late 1990s. The DNA profile from that record shared enough markers to suggest a close relative. Analysts concluded that the cigarette DNA likely belonged to a male of the same family line. The probability estimate exceeded 99%. Detectives cross-referenced historical employment data from 1982. A name emerged: Thomas Ndlovu, a machine operator at a mechanical plant near the Kensington industrial zone. His address at the time placed him less than 1 kilometer from the crime scene. The file, dormant for decades, now carried a living name. Investigators reconstructed his history through employment records, census entries and identification archives. Ndlovu had remained in Johannesburg his entire life. He had married, raised 2 children, and retired quietly. There were no recent offenses or outstanding warrants. To confirm identity, detectives obtained a court order authorizing collection of a reference DNA sample. In February 2020, 2 officers arrived at his residence in Rudeport. They presented the warrant and explained the purpose. Ndlovu complied, offering his cheek swab without resistance. The sample was sealed and transported under supervision. The laboratory processed it within 10 days. The match to Exhibit 14B returned absolute confirmation, the same genetic profile. Chain of custody documentation verified that both samples were uncontaminated. Each step had been witnessed and signed. The evidence now linked Ndlovu directly to the crime scene from 1982. Detectives reviewed the timeline. Ndlovu's shift at the factory had ended at 9:45 p.m. The victim's estimated time of death was around 10 shu. The walking route from the factory to the field was 8 minutes. Witness statements from 1982 had described a man in blue overalls near the bus stop around that time. The alignment was exact. The arrest warrant was signed within the week. Officers moved discreetly. There was no public announcement, no press presence. 2 unmarked vehicles approached the Rue de Port property at dawn. The air was still. When officers knocked, Ndlovu answered wearing a grey work jacket. He appeared calm as he was informed of the charge. Detectives recorded his statement and concluded the session. The transcript was typed that evening, stamped, and attached to the case file. Over the next weeks, the investigative team revisited every aspect of the 1982 case to ensure evidentiary strength. They verified that no procedural gaps could undermine admissibility. Every original photograph was scanned at high resolution. The location of the cigarette butt was plotted again on modern maps using coordinates derived from the crime scene sketch. The diagram showed precise proximity to the victim's body, less than 1 meter, within the estimated attack zone. Forensic reconstruction experts recreated the timeline using simulation software. Variables included distance, lighting, and environmental conditions recorded in 1982 meteorological data. The model indicated that visibility was limited, supporting the theory that the assailant approached undetected. The modern investigation was documented thoroughly. Audio recordings, digital evidence, and written summaries filled multiple binders. Each document bore new case numbers linked to the old file. Together, they formed an unbroken chain of procedural continuity spanning nearly 40 years. During this phase, the suspect's background underwent detailed review. Interviews with former co-workers revealed fragments of behavior. Several remembered him as quiet and private. One described him as prone to sudden temper, though never violent at work. Another recalled that he often smoked near the factory's rear gate, the direction leading toward Kensington. No one remembered any direct link between him and the victim. Investigators established that both had used the same bus line, though likely at different times of day. The proximity of their routes suggested only chance intersection. As the case neared charging stage, prosecutors reviewed the file for completeness. Legal experts assessed whether the lapse of time could affect fairness of trial. Their conclusion was clear. DNA evidence provided objective proof that outweighed the passage of years. When the announcement was made internally, officers from multiple generations attended the briefing. The older detectives, some now consultants, listened as the younger team outlined the reconstruction. The presentation displayed side-by-side photographs, the black and white crime scene images from 1982 and the color laboratory images from 2020. The difference in decades was visible, yet the object at the center of both was identical, the cigarette butt. Labeled Exhibit 14B, the room was quiet as the briefing ended. The only sound was the low hum of the projector cooling fan. The following morning, the police press office issued a short statement confirming the arrest. It noted that a suspect had been charged following advanced forensic analysis of historical evidence. No names were released pending court proceedings. The wording was factual and restrained. Public reaction was minimal. The story appeared briefly on local radio, summarized in 2 sentences. Viewed listeners connected it to the 1982 case until print media followed with a short article referencing the original event. The photograph accompanying the report showed the old evidence cabinet, not the people involved. Inside the forensic laboratory, staff catalogued the case as a benchmark in archival preservation. The technician, who had first unsealed the envelope, gave a procedural report noting that despite environmental changes, the DNA had remained viable due to the dry climate and wax paper barrier. The report circulated among regional labs as evidence that historical samples could retain forensic value far beyond expected limits. As the prosecution prepared, attention turned to confirming every link of evidence handling. The original 1982 officers who had collected and sealed the exhibits were identified through their signatures. 2 were deceased. One was located in retirement in Durban. His statement, taken under oath, confirmed that he had collected the cigarette butt himself and sealed it at the scene. That verification bridged the gap between the past and present. Meanwhile, Ndlovu remained in custody. His demeanor was calm during remand hearings. He answered procedural questions with brief replies. His defense counsel argued for bail on the basis of age and health. The court denied it, citing the gravity of the charge and strength of evidence. The judge's tone was even, formal. The gavel struck once, echoing softly in the courtroom. As the case advanced toward trial, journalists sought access to older documents for historical context. Police provided declassified materials, photographs of the evidence storage facility, typed reports, and procedural notes, with identifying details redacted. These images appeared in national newspapers, accompanied by explanations of how DNA evidence had transformed cold case investigations. The coverage emphasized method, not drama. Within law enforcement, the breakthrough was discussed less as a singular achievement and more as a model of endurance. Officers recognized that it reflected institutional memory rather than individual discovery. The case had survived not through active pursuit, but through the quiet efficiency of record-keeping. Each clerk, each technician, each form had unknowingly contributed to eventual resolution. The arrest marked a shift in policy. The National Forensic Board authorized renewed review of other cases stored under similar conditions. Laboratories began testing dozens of preserved samples from the 1970s and 1980s. Several yielded usable profiles, reopening investigations long thought lost. The Kensington case thus became precedent, a tangible demonstration of why silence could still contain evidence. In internal seminars, instructors displayed the preserved envelope and its new digital counterpart. The training slides contrasted the old wax seal with the modern barcode, explaining how consistent documentation enabled scientific continuity. Recruits learned that evidence, once properly sealed, could outlive both investigator and suspect. The officers involved in the arrest remained cautious about interpretation. They spoke in procedural language, describing the case as an example of persistence rather than revelation. The emotional dimension belonged to the family, not the police. Their role was to close the circle between record and reality. The culmination of 4 decades of silence was not marked by celebration, only quiet acknowledgement. The lead investigator signed the final pretrial summary, then returned the file to secure storage. The faint scratch of pen on paper was the only sound in the room. Outside, the evening air pressed cool against the windows. In the distance, city traffic moved steadily, a rhythm indifferent to the passage of years. Inside the archive, the original envelope was resealed and labeled Exhibit Returned, Court Evidence 2020. It joined modern files on the shelf, indistinguishable except for the handwriting of another era. The breakthrough that solved the Kensington case was not the result of discovery alone, but of preservation, of countless small acts that had kept a fragment of evidence safe until science could read its story. The arrest completed what the first investigators had begun. A single trace left on a cigarette filter, overlooked for decades, had carried the truth across time. The trial opened in August 2021 at the Johannesburg High Court. The courtroom was small, its wooden benches worn from years of use. Proceedings began without public spectacle. Only a handful of reporters attended, seated quietly behind the press barrier. The air conditioning hummed softly above the sound of shuffling papers at the front. The presiding judge read the charge: the murder of Elaine van Rensburg, committed on June 14, 1982. The accused, Thomas Ndlovu, stood beside his attorney, listening without visible reaction. His hands rested on the dock rail. He wore plain clothing, no handcuffs. When asked to enter a plea, he said 2 words: not guilty. The prosecution opened with a factual summary. The state outlined how DNA collected from a cigarette butt at the original crime scene had produced a full genetic profile matched conclusively to the defendant. The sequence of evidence handling was described step by step, from the first officer on scene to the modern laboratory tests. Every transition in custody was supported by signed documentation. The prosecutor spoke evenly, avoiding dramatization. The focus was continuity. The defense argued procedural decay. They questioned the preservation conditions, the memory of witnesses, and the absence of physical evidence beyond the DNA. Their position was that the passage of time had eroded reliability. They claimed contamination could not be ruled out. The judge noted each objection without comment. The first witnesses were forensic specialists. They described how the cigarette filter had been stored and tested. Charts projected onto the courtroom wall showed genetic peaks and comparison markers. The testimony was technical, precise, and steady. When asked if contamination could have caused a false match, the analyst answered directly, no. Chain of custody checks confirmed integrity. Next came the retired detective who had sealed the original envelope in 1982. His memory was limited, but he remembered collecting the cigarette near the victim's body. He described how it had been handled, labeled, and locked away. His tone was matter-of-fact. His presence linked the investigation's beginning to its end. The judge listened closely, occasionally adjusting his glasses. When the victim's brother appeared via video link from abroad, the courtroom was silent. He spoke briefly, confirming identification of his sister in the old photographs and describing the family's decades of waiting. His voice was steady. At one point he paused, the faint static of the connection audible in the quiet. He thanked the investigators for their persistence, then ended his statement with a single line: "Time did not change what happened, but it allowed the truth to surface." The defense presented no witnesses other than the accused. Ndlovu testified for less than an hour. He denied involvement and claimed to have been home on the night of the murder. When asked why his DNA appeared on the cigarette near the victim, he suggested the item could have been dropped on another day while walking through the area. The prosecutor countered with timeline evidence showing that the field was not a public path and that the cigarette was found beneath material disturbed during the assault. The exchange was brief. Throughout proceedings, the judge maintained decorum. There were no raised voices, no emotional displays. The gallery remained still, the quiet broken only by the creak of benches as people shifted occasionally. After 7 days of testimony, the court adjourned for deliberation. The written judgment was delivered 2 weeks later. The decision, 50 pages long, began with procedural history and detailed every link in the evidence chain. The judge noted that the DNA evidence met the highest standard of scientific reliability. He concluded that the probability of accidental contamination was negligible. The physical position of the cigarette, combined with the fiber match from the factory uniform, established presence at the scene beyond reasonable doubt. The judgment stated the accused's genetic material was found within immediate proximity to the deceased. No plausible alternative explanation exists for its presence. The chain of evidence has been verified across 4 decades without break. The court finds the accused guilty as charged. The sentence followed the next day, life imprisonment. When the verdict was read, Ndlovu stood motionless. He showed no visible reaction as officers approached. He was escorted quietly from the courtroom. The door closed with a muted click. For the Van Rensburg family, the outcome brought a kind of stillness. There were no statements to the press, no interviews. The detective liaison informed them of the verdict by phone. The father listened in silence, then asked that the information be sent in writing. The official letter arrived 2 days later, printed on standard police stationery. It was placed with the others in the same folder that held the original 1982 notice. The brother, speaking later to a journalist off record, said only that the verdict ended uncertainty, not absence. "We waited for truth," he said, "and truth arrived without ceremony. The media coverage was brief and factual. Headlines focused on the forensic success rather than the individual case. One newspaper described it as a case solved by time and discipline." The article noted that the breakthrough had come not from new witnesses or confession, but from preservation, a small object stored correctly. Rediscovered by procedure, within law enforcement, the case became a reference model. The National Forensic Science Institute used it as a teaching tool on archival management. Training modules cited the exact storage conditions that preserved the sample. Officers learned how meticulous documentation across decades could sustain justice. The file itself was digitized in full. Every page from 1982 was scanned and stored in the national database under a new category, Resolved Historical Homicides. The physical documents were sealed again, now marked Do Not Destroy. The evidence box was placed in long-term retention storage at the Forensic Archive. The lighting in that room was dim, temperature steady, air filtered to protect the paper. In 2022, a small internal ceremony marked the case closure. Only investigators and analysts attended. There were no speeches. The lead detective read the closure summary, confirming that all objectives had been completed. At the end, the box was placed on a metal shelf among hundreds of others. The label read simply K820614, closed, conviction 2021. Forensic officers later published a technical report summarizing the DNA methods used in the case. The report emphasized that low-level biological material could remain viable under proper storage for more than 30 years. The findings influenced new protocols across the country. Old evidence collections were re-examined with renewed care. Laboratories improved their cataloging systems, ensuring that future generations would inherit organized archives. Beyond institutional impact, the case carried quiet meaning for those involved. One analyst described the experience as proof that patience in procedure could outlast emotion. Another noted that every sealed envelope represented a promise, that facts, once recorded, should never be abandoned. Among the public, the story faded quickly. It resurfaced occasionally in discussions about forensic reform, but never in sensational terms. The narrative remained one of endurance and process, not tragedy. At the Van Rensburg home, life continued without visible change. The father's health declined gradually. He passed away in late 2022, several months after the verdict. In his room, police found a neatly arranged folder containing all correspondence about the case. On top was the last letter from the Cold Case Division confirming conviction. Below it lay the original newspaper clipping from 1982, edges yellowed with age. His son arranged for the documents to be donated to the Johannesburg Historical Archive. They were accepted as part of a collection on forensic development in South Africa. The archivist handling the donation recorded each item under accession code 23040001JHB. The pages were preserved behind glass. A small label read, Case K820614, resolved through DNA analysis 2021. For the investigators, closure came through procedure. Reports were filed, exhibits logged, and responsibilities concluded. The final memorandum, signed by the regional commander, summarized the outcome in 3 lines. Conviction achieved. File archived. Case closed. The broader significance lay not in emotion, but in example. The Kensington investigation demonstrated that precision could bridge decades. It proved that evidence, preserved with discipline, could speak when witnesses no longer could. In training sessions, instructors often ended lectures with the same observation: Records are memory. The statement echoed through classrooms, repeated quietly by recruits learning the structure of documentation. They understood that cases like Kensington were not only about solving crimes, but about maintaining the continuity of truth through time. The building where the evidence was stored remains operational. The aisle containing the 1982 cases is quiet. Dust gathers slowly along the lower shelves. Labels marked resolved stand beside those still reading unsolved. Technicians pass through daily, their footsteps soft against concrete. The lights flicker briefly as motion sensors activate. The air remains dry and still. In that silence, each sealed envelope carries the same possibility that one day technology will meet preservation again. The Kensington case ended with a name, a conviction, and a final record entered into the National Archive. But its legacy continued quietly in the routines of forensic discipline, the measured handwriting of 1982, the barcode of 2020, the continuous thread between them. Justice had arrived, not through revelation, but through endurance.